Into the ditches I cast them, the corpses of their warriors I caused to fill the wide field. With their blood like wool I colored the mountain. Many of their chariots, horses trained to the yoke, I took from him. A column of heads at the entrance of his city I fixed together. His cities I destroyed, I devastated, I burnt with fire. Shalmaneser III. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Conqueror's Podcast. Episode 5.3, Shalmaneser III. Last episode, we covered the reigns of Ashurnasirpal II, Adad-nirari II, and Tukulti-Ninurta II, the three Assyrian kings under whom Assyria entered its recovery phase and again became a regional power of Mesopotamia. We then focused on the reign and conquests of Ashurnasirpal II, under whom Assyria truly became an empire. It was also under him that the brutality and ruthlessness for which the Assyrians are famous for even today began to be implemented as a state policy against its enemies, especially rebels. With the death of Ashurnasirpal II, the throne passed to his son, Shalmaneser III. Now, as a great job it may sound, it's not that easy being a king or an emperor. I'm talking, of course, if you're a sane, normal person who cares about his country and people, not a Caligula or an Elagabalus type. That's especially true when your empire is one that constantly faces wars and rebellions, and when your predecessor, who just happens to be your dad, did an awesome job at it like Ashurnasirpal II did. In most cases throughout history, men like Ashurnasirpal simply left shoes too big for their heirs to fill. In others, they turned out to be complete failures. For example, Commodus, aka the Mad, and Selim II, aka the Drunk. In Shalmaneser's case, however, he turned out to be more than capable of filling his father's shoes, in the process proving himself to be as ambitious, energetic, and ruthless, and in his staggering 35-year-long reign, he would maintain his father's average of about a campaign per year. Before I get into Shalmaneser's reign, I want to cover the instrument that enabled his and his father's conquest, the Assyrian Army. Last time I discussed the Assyrian Army was when I talked about the Middle Assyrian Empire in the background episode. By Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser's reign, however, Assyrian society had fully evolved into a warrior society with an obligatory military service for all Assyrian free men. Still, it was far from the later professional army of Tiglath-Pileser III, as most of these men would be farmers, with a small core of professional full-time soldiers, which meant that the campaigning season was still limited by the harvest season, when the farmers had to go back to their fields. Conquest and expansion were now seen as a destiny and mandate from the god Ashur. The king, whose rule was sanctioned by the gods, was expected to personally lead the army and campaign annually. He would appoint senior officers on certain occasions in his place, and we will see a notable case of such appointment in this episode. Now, what truly set the Assyrian army apart was its organization. From its assembly and training to its march, supply, and leadership, the Assyrian army was no doubt the best organized force in the world. To support their vast campaigns, the Assyrians established throughout their empire the world's first system of roads, that included many stations for rest and for replacing mounts. As a result of its superior organization and discipline, the Assyrian army could march at a pace of 30 miles a day. In terms of numbers, by the reign of Shalmaneser, tens of thousands of men could be mustered for a campaign by the viceroy of Ashur. Regarding its composition, as the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded, it increasingly incorporated soldiers and units from its newly subjugated people, as well as their military styles and weapons. The infantry was of course the most numerous, with archers, armed with a composite bow, being the most important infantry unit. The importance of the archer is supported by the fact that from the time of Ashurnasirpal, each archer would be accompanied by a shield bearer that would protect him, especially while reloading. It is also during the reigns of Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser that the cavalry began to dominate the army, replacing the chariot. The adoption of cavalry was forced on the Assyrians as they increasingly faced such units when fighting their nomad neighbors, and most of all, the Urartians. It took them many years to fully master this art, and during this period, the Assyrian cavalry was quite different than the one that pops to our mind, with images from the reign of Ashurnasirpal depicting them in pairs, with one rider holding both reins and the other shooting with a bow. Yep, two guys on each horse. Definitely weird. Regarding our sources for his reign, just like his father, Shalmaneser wasn't exactly a modest guy, and he wanted to make sure that his achievements would be engraved and remembered. So what did he do? Well, other than the usual temple and monument building, Shalmaneser first added his own massive section to the already gigantic palace in Kalah, which was itself, remember, less than 50 years old, before going on to build his own palace, and in them he made sure that as many inscriptions as possible glorifying him and his achievements were engraved. Add to that the fact that he reigned for 35 years, that's a lot of inscriptions. Another notable monument from Shalmaneser's reign is the Black Obelisk. The Black Obelisk is a black limestone bas-relief sculpture that was erected as a public monument in 825 BC. It was found in the ruins of Kalah, and is the most complete Assyrian obelisk yet discovered. On its top and bottom there is a long cuneiform inscription recording the annals of Shalmaneser III. It lists the military campaigns which the king and his commander-in-chief headed every year, until the 31st year of his reign. It is also historically significant because it displays the earliest depiction of a people called the Israelites. Like all other Assyrian kings, we don't have any information about the year in which Shalmaneser was born. He was given the name Shalmaneser, or Shulmanu Ashurdu, meaning the god Shulmanu is preeminent. As the heir apparent, he would have taken part in his father's many campaigns, gaining military experience and witnessing firsthand all his father's terror tactics. He would have also been given an administrative position in the now enlarged empire. If I am to go for the same logic I used in the previous episode, Shalmaneser was probably in his late 20s when he assumed the throne in 859 BC. Just like his father, the first year of his reign didn't see any major military action. He probably spent it consolidating his rule, planning his first steps as king, and probably receiving, or demanding, tribute from the empire's now many vassals, a sort of recognition of authority customary with the ascension of a new king. I say this because it soon became known to Shalmaneser III that most of the predominantly Aramean territories that were made vassals by his father seemed to have formed a coalition, refusing to send tribute or acknowledging Assyrian rule. Prominent among these states were Carchemish, that had previously submitted to his father without a fight, and of course, Beit Adini, now ruled by a king called Akhuni. In 858 BC, Shalmaneser launched his first campaign, with his target being Carchemish and the states to its northwest. Despite stiff resistance, all opposition was brutally put down, as Shalmaneser first pacified whatever resistance he faced east of the Euphrates, before crossing it, then the Orontes, before reaching the Mediterranean, defeating any force that dared to face him and taking any town or city in his path. And as I stated in the previous episode, if there was one thing that the Assyrians were especially touchy about, are rebellions. And although most of these states were just vassals, not outright provinces, for the Assyrians it really wasn't that different. Other than the usual brutal and gruesome punishments, flaying, impalement, deportations, Shalmaneser now wanted to end whatever semblance of independence these states had, and to fully annex them to the empire. In 857 BC, Shalmaneser launched his second campaign, this time directed against the southern states, chief amongst them being Beit Adini. In another swift campaign, the king defeated all opposition, this time succeeding where even his great father had failed, taking Tel Barsip, the capital of Beit Adini, though its king, Akhuni, was able to escape. The now fully conquered areas were reorganized into a single province called the province of Beit Adini. Assyrian colonists were encouraged to settle the new province, and Assyrian governors appointed to rule with Assyrian law. The administrative centers for the province were to be Tel Barsip, now renamed to Kar Shulmanu Ashirdu, or Kar Shalmaneser, meaning domain of Shalmaneser, and from a town called Pitru, located 20 kilometers south of Carchemish, which was also renamed to Ashurnasirpal. The capture and upgrade in the status of Petru was especially symbolic for the Assyrians and Shalmaneser, as the town had been founded by the king's illustrious ancestor, Tiglath-Pileser I, more than 200 years ago, and had fallen to the Arameans. Now it was back to Assyrian hands. Happy to leave the administrative task to subordinates, Shalmaneser set out to the north from Kar Shalmaneser in 856 BC to deal with a new power that was rising on the borders of Assyria, the kingdom of Urartu. I first mentioned the lands north of the Taurus Mountains when I covered the campaigns of Ashurnasirpal in that area. These lands were inhabited by many tribes and peoples and were simply called lands of the Nairi. By the reign of Shalmaneser III, however, these lands were united under a single king called Arame, and formed the kingdom the Assyrians called Urartu. Its lands covered most of today's Armenian highlands, and its people are today considered the ancestors of the Armenians. This kingdom was much influenced by the Assyrians, with their chief god being very similar to Ashur, and their adoption of the Assyrians' writing system. Just a side note here, if you look at a map and see the location of the modern state of Armenia, you'll see that it doesn't include the lands I mentioned. These lands, together with modern Armenia, form what is today called, by the Armenians at least, historical Great Armenia. Yet, despite being the homeland of the Armenians, these lands are today part of Turkey. We don't know who attacked first. On the one hand, although newly united under a single ruler, the highlanders of Urartu were a warrior people, used to attacking and raiding the people of the plains, and the Army may have continued this tradition, provoking Shalmaneser's invasion. On the other, we can't deny that Shalmaneser was an expansionist king, who either for a slight offense, or for the sake of expansion alone, simply saw that, having achieved quiet on his western front, he had now the chance to attack on a new front. Shalmaneser marched north along the upper Tigris, passing through the now fully Assyrianized Beit Zamani. He entered the territory of Urartu from the southwest and ravaged the land of Enzit, modern-day Sirt province in Turkey. He then marched north towards the river Arsanias, today's Murat River in eastern Turkey, plundering and burning everything in his path. He then set his sights on the Urartian capital of Arzashkun, located north of Lake Van. Despite its description as having double walls and towers, it quickly fell to the Assyrian army, before being sacked and destroyed. The king then continued north to Mount Erythia, where he had either inscriptions or a stele made as a monument for his great campaign. Something which I personally don't get. I mean, it's obvious at that stage that he wasn't going to hold on to these conquests, so it's pretty clear that as soon as the Assyrians were to leave, that the Urartians would simply destroy it. So what's the point in making it, right? Anyway, Shalmaneser now decided to head back south, this time to the east of Lake Van. The army continued its path of destruction and plundering of Urartian lands until reaching Assyrian territory, showing up next to Arbela. Although Urartu survived and the territorial gains were little, the campaign was a great success. Urartian defenses were easily destroyed, the empire's northern frontier was expanded, and much plunder was taken. As easy as it sounds to us, logistically, this campaign was one hell of an undertaking, and its planning and execution speak volumes on the quality and organization of the Assyrian army. The Armenian highlands, in which most of the campaign occurred, is a rough terrain, with an average elevation of more than 1500 meters, with high mountains and deep valleys that would present a challenge even to a modern army. Just think about it. The supplies, the organization of thousands of men, the climate, and all that before we add the fact that it was all done in enemy territory. All these were overcome with what was to be the finest military machine of the ancient world for more than 200 years. After the northern campaign, the king would shift his focus to the western front. In 855 BC, he came back to the now province of Beit Adini to finish the job. He hunted down Akhuni and defeated his remaining forces in an open battle, capturing him and his remaining forces, as well as much booty, before taking them back to Assyria. There is no records regarding his fate, but I wouldn't be surprised if his skin ended up decorating the walls of Kalah or Ashur. With the annexation of these territories, the empire now shared borders with new states to the south, and it seems that Shalmaneser immediately set his sight on these lands, hitherto never conquered by the Assyrians. And it is actually in the reign of Shalmaneser that the idea of reconquering lost Assyrian lands begins to be replaced by conquest of new lands for the sake of expansion. The king spent 854 BC organizing the empire's new province that was to be the base of his future campaigns in Syria. Scouts were probably sent and routes for the future campaigns drawn. In 853 BC, the first campaign for the conquest of the rest of Syria was launched. The first target was the city of Aleppo, which submitted without a fight. After performing sacrifices for the storm god Haddad, Shalmaneser marched south, with his next target being the kingdom of Hamath. Its king, Irhulini, refused to submit, and consequently, Shalmaneser ordered that the land surrounding the capital be plundered and burnt. While plundering a town called Karkar, however, troubling news reached the king. A great coalition, described by him as composed of armies sent by 12 kings, chief amongst whom were Hadad-ezer of Damascus and Irhulini, was assembling nearby, with the aim of resisting further Assyrian incursions into their lands. A description by the king survived in the form of a great stele that, together with another great stele ordered by his father, are called the Kirch monolith. He described the coalition in the following words: quote, Karkar, his royal city, I destroyed, I devastated, I burnt with fire. 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, 20,000 soldiers of Hadad-ezer of Aram Damascus, 700 chariot, 700 cavalry, 10,000 soldiers of Irhulini of Hamath, 2,000 chariots, 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite, 500 soldiers of the Guians, 1,000 soldiers of the Musrians, 10 chariots, 10,000 soldiers of the Erkanatians, 200 soldiers of Matinu Ba'il, the Arvadite, 200 soldiers of the Osanatians, 30 chariots and the lost figure of soldiers of Adunu Ba'il, the Shianian, 1,000 camels of Gindibu the Arabian, 100 soldiers of Basa, son of Ruhubi the Ammonite. These 12 kings he brought to his support. To offer battle and fight they came against me. End quote. This description is notable for a number of reasons. First, the numbers of combatants described. More than 3,900 chariots, 2,900 cavalry, including some badass camels, and more than 52,000 infantry. These numbers are insane, and that's even before including the Assyrian force, which must have been comparable in size. This means that combined, around 100,000 combatants took part in this battle, which is of course a highly unlikely figure to say the least. Accurate numbers are of course difficult to determine, but given that the coalition force was composed of forces sent by many kingdoms, some of whom like Damascus, Hamath, and Israel had the resources to equip a force of some thousands, especially so close to their lands, a figure of 20 to 25,000 for each side seems possible. Now, this number may not sound like a lot, but remember, we are talking about more than 2,800 years ago, and a force of such size, operating so far from the core of the empire, would dwarf most comparable armies of the medieval period 2,000 years later. 2. Although described as a coalition of 12 kings, only 11 are mentioned. Given that such a mistake is highly improbable, and if it was a mistake, we can only imagine the fate of the guy responsible when Shalmaneser read it and found out about it, I tend to go with the explanation that either one of these kingdoms actually refers to two kingdoms that we today simply don't distinguish between, or that the modern translation of one of these kingdoms is actually the name of two separate kingdoms. 3. The stele contains the first reliable mention of a biblical figure by an outside source, that of King Ahab of Israel. It is also notable for the first ever mention in history of a people called the Arabs. Shalmaneser immediately led his army to meet the coalition forces, and in what must have been a great battle, he utterly crushed the coalition army, and in his own words, quote, I routed them, 14,000 of their warriors I slew with the sword. Like Hadad, I rained destruction upon them. I scattered their corpses far and wide, and covered the face of the desolate plain with their wide-spreading armies. With my weapons I made their blood to flow down the valleys of the land." End quote. However, the real outcome of the battle seems to have been inconclusive. This is supported by the fact that no conquest followed this great victory, and that at least 3 more pitched battles would follow before any concrete gains were achieved by the Assyrians. Also, we are told that in the next year, the cities of Carchemish and Beit Agusi refused to send tribute. Had the king truly achieved such a great victory, these cities wouldn't have dared rise against him, as they would be the only targets for the king to attack now. These facts, coupled with the Assyrian habit of never directly acknowledging defeats and sometimes claim exaggerated victories, leads us to the conclusion that the Battle of Karkar ended in a stalemate. Shalmaneser, however, was by no means satisfied with this outcome, and he considered his next steps on the Western Front. A great part of being a great general isn't just to attack successfully, it's also knowing when and when not to attack. Shalmaneser was a great general, and he knew that the coalition formed against him couldn't hold forever. Such a coalition couldn't be sustained by Damascus and Hamath, his main targets, and every king would, sooner or later, need his forces, either for his own needs or to bicker with one another. All Shalmaneser needed to do was to wait. And wait he did, for 5 years. This waiting, however, was interrupted in 851 BC from an unexpected direction: Babylon. Its king's younger brother had revolted, and the kingdom was split between the two, with the brother taking the northern part of the kingdom. Shalmaneser decided to intervene on behalf of the king. In his own words, "In the 8th year of my reign, Marduk bil Usati, the younger brother, revolted against Marduk Zakir Shumi, king of Karduniash, and they divided the land in its entirety. In order to avenge Marduk Zakir Shumi, I marched out and captured Miturnat. In the 9th year of my reign, I marched against Akkad a second time. I besieged Ganan Nati. As for Marduk bil Usati, the terrifying splendor of Ashur and Marduk overcame him, and he went up into the mountains to save his life. I cut down with the sword Marduk bil Usati and the rebel army officers who were with him." End quote. 3 things I'll note here. 1. We don't know the reason behind Shalmaneser's enthusiastic intervention in Babylonian affairs. It may have been due to his father's treaty, a later treaty between him and the king of Babylon, or a simple desire for quiet on the southern front. 2. Again, despite obviously having the power to conquer Babylon, especially in its current weakness, Shalmaneser simply defeated the usurper, took some loot, gave back the territory, and in 850 BC went back to the Western Front. No annexation is mentioned, nor a harshening of the terms with Babylon, something that is again given no explanation. 3. The reverence of the Assyrians to Marduk is an indication of just how important of a religious center Babylon was, and gives a possible explanation for Assyria's reluctance to conquer Babylon. By 849 BC, with no distractions on any other front, Shalmaneser was completely set on Syria. We don't have much details over the next 9 years, but the Great Unified Coalition slowly broke away. Shalmaneser launched campaigns annually, and 3 pitched battles against the Syrians are recorded, in 849, 848, and 845 BC, indicating just how much of a stubborn enemy they really were. Hamath was first to fall to Shalmaneser before he continued to his most stubborn enemy, Damascus and its king Hadad-ezer. It resisted fiercely, and it only faltered when a man called Hazael seized power by murdering Hadad-ezer in 841 BC. Hazael wasn't as capable as Hadad-ezer, and soon Shalmaneser was able to defeat him. Damascus itself survived, withstanding a number of Assyrian assaults, but was from now on isolated, surrounded on all fronts by Assyrian territory, as Shalmaneser pushed south all the way to Mount Carmel, modern-day northern Israel. By 840 BC, Assyrian territory extended across central and southern Syria, as well as northern Phoenicia, with the exception of Damascus, of course, while southern Phoenicia and the Kingdom of Israel were made vassals of the empire. The king recorded receiving tribute from Tyre, Sidon, and even Yehu, the king of Israel, called Samaria in Assyrian annals. No further military action is recorded in Syria, and the last mention of the southwestern front is of another tribute received from Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos in 838 BC. But Syria wasn't the only new western territory Shalmaneser was eyeing. To the northwest, Shalmaneser knew that the farthest his father had reached was the Amanos Mountains. And as we're going to see throughout the podcast, on the very rare occasions that a great conqueror succeeded a great conqueror, the later would have this urge, this need to surpass his predecessor, either due to it being expected from him, to show that he is better, or simply as a result of a very human trait, insecurity. This constant feeling that he needs to be as great as his predecessor. And in most cases, this predecessor was his dad. In 839 BC, Shalmaneser crossed the Amanos Mountains, entering the region of Cilicia, modern-day southern Turkey. In what was more of a raid than a campaign of conquest, many settlements were plundered before the Assyrians decided to head back to Kar Shalmaneser. In 837 BC, they were back, with a bigger force and clearer objectives. They penetrated deeper north, first reaching the kingdom of Melid, which submitted willingly, offering tribute. The next target was the kingdom of Tabal. After some initial resistance, which was met with some good old Assyrian brute force, the kingdom submitted, with its 24 kings recorded as sending tribute. The king then continued his march west, reaching the land of Khubishna, before heading back. More campaigns were launched in 836, 834, and 833 BC, further weakening local resistance while strengthening Assyrian presence. More cities were attacked and plundered, garrisons were established, and local leaders brought into the fold or replaced with complacent ones. By the end of these campaigns, Cilicia was in Assyrian hands, and other than a relatively small rebellion, which we'll get to in a bit, no further trouble arose for many years. By now, there is one last front I haven't covered yet, the Eastern Front. If you thought that Shalmaneser was going to neglect any of the empire's frontiers, well, you're wrong. The king launched two campaigns, one in 843 BC and one in 835 BC. The first campaign penetrated deep into the land of Zamoa, where a number of fortresses were taken and many settlements plundered. The king then headed south, plundering the kingdoms of Alabria, Parsua, Abdadani, and Khaban, all located in modern-day northwestern Iran and eastern Iraq. Major resistance was only met when he entered the kingdom of Namri, which lay on his empire's southeastern border, stretching across modern-day eastern Iraq and western Iran. A pitched battle was fought with the king of Namri, Marduk Mudammiq, whom after being defeated, had his palace plundered, and was replaced with a man called Yanzu, who was to be a vassal of the empire. The second campaign to the east was launched in 835 BC, in response to the refusal of Yanzu to pay the annual tribute. Shalmaneser crossed the Zab River and invaded Namri. Yanzu fled to the mountains, and the country was ravaged and left empty. Shalmaneser then headed north to the territory of Parsua, where tribute was received, before turning east to the country of Ilipi, which was inhabited by a certain Iranian people called the Medes, who, just let me tell you, we're going to talk about them a lot in the future. Other than sacking several cities, Yanzu was captured and taken back to Assyria, and I guess you know by now what kind of fate awaited him. Shalmaneser headed back to Assyria, before continuing to Cilicia to continue the aforementioned campaigns. By 833 BC, Shalmaneser was in his mid-50s. Remember what I said in the previous episode. Don't look at it as our mid-50s. In that period, for a man to reach this age, and to be as healthy and active as Shalmaneser seems to have been, was no small feat. The king himself was probably aware of that, and it may have played a significant part in the king's surprising decision for the next series of campaigns to the north. The king wasn't going to personally lead the army. What's truly remarkable is that the man he chose to lead the army wasn't his heir, but a man, probably a noble, by the name of Dayan Ashur, who was made Tartanu, commander-in-chief. Other than the fact that his name was recorded, something which was remarkable on its own, from what I was able to find at least, it's the first time such a delegation of power and independent command by an Assyrian king is recorded. The reason behind it isn't known or recorded anywhere, but what is known is that in time, Dayan Ashur's power and influence would increase, eventually playing a part in the great rebellion that would plague Shalmaneser's last years. Since Shalmaneser didn't lead these campaigns personally, I'm not going to get too much into them. The first campaign was launched in 832 BC, followed by 4 more in 830, 829, 828, and 827 BC. The main focus of these campaigns was, of course, the kingdom of Urartu, who by now had a new king by the name of Sarduri. These campaigns didn't achieve any territorial gains, but they did bring a lot of plunder, especially horses, and kept the northern frontier in check. Shalmaneser did lead the army at least one more time in 831 BC in response to a rebellion in the vassal kingdom of Patinu, where a man by the name of Surri assassinated the client king Lubarna III and usurped his throne. Patinu lay to the south of the Amanus Mountains, thus controlling the approaches to the newly acquired lands in Cilicia, so it was extremely important for the Assyrians to quickly bring back order. When the Assyrian army appeared at the gates of the capital of Kinalwa, identified with Tel Ta'inat, close to Antioch in modern-day Turkey, the inhabitants handed over the rebels, who may have been executed right there. After receiving tribute and appointing a new client king, Shalmaneser departed. Before reaching the last part of Shalmaneser's story, I'll talk a bit about the other aspects of his reign. Like any other great king, Shalmaneser was a prolific builder, ordering numerous construction projects throughout his reign. These projects were launched across the empire and were not limited to the major cities. In his early years, Shalmaneser preferred to reside in Nineveh, and the city benefited accordingly. After moving his residence to Kalah, he completed, renovated, or expanded several structures begun by his father, including completing the capital's great walls. His greatest project was no doubt the construction of Fort Shalmaneser, located in the southeast corner of the city, which was to serve as his personal palace and as the royal arsenal. By the way, we know for a fact that it was built by Shalmaneser III because archaeologists found numerous bricks with the king's name on them. Yep, Shalmaneser wanted to make it clear that it was his palace. Let's not forget the city of Ashur, the one that gave the empire its name, remember, as it also received much attention. Administratively, the king mostly continued his father's policies, especially that of appointing Assyrian governors, men loyal to him, in as many parts of the empire as he was able to. The last years of Shalmaneser's reign, however, took a turn for the worse, when in 827 BC, a rebellion erupted that threatened to destroy his legacy and perhaps the empire itself. That this rebellion would go on to be called by some the Great Rebellion should give us an idea about it. What truly set this rebellion apart, however, other than its scale of course, was the fact that it was led by none other than the king's son and possible heir, Ashurnasirpal, as well as the fact that it involved no fewer than 27 cities in the Assyrian heartland itself, including Nineveh, Erbil, and even Ashur. We don't know what caused the rebellion. The fact that it involved virtually most of the towns and cities of the homeland indicates that it wasn't merely a result of the king's age or of Ashurnasirpal's frustration, although there is no doubt that the latter did play a role, along with Dayan Ashur's increasing power and influence. Some scholars suggest that it may have been due to the populace frustration at the exhausting demands the continuous campaigning made on Assyria's manpower and resources. Others say that it was due to the perceived unfairness of the distribution of the rewards of victory, which don't seem to have trickled down to the lower ranks of Assyrian society. Regardless of the cause, there is no doubt that this rebellion was the greatest threat Shalmaneser III faced in a 35-year-long reign. The great king was aided by his son and now heir, the future Shamshi-Adad V, as well as his commander-in-chief, Dayan Ashur. When Shalmaneser III died in 824 BC, the Great Rebellion was still raging. His great conquests and achievements probably gave him little comfort in his final days, and he probably died a broken, disappointed man. Despite that, in my opinion, he is still worth to be included in the list of great conquerors, as most of his conquests eventually endured beyond his death, and despite the rebellion, the imperial apparatus was strong enough to survive. Finally, he was wise enough in his choice of a successor, as Shamshi-Adad V proved himself a capable and energetic ruler, and although it took him an additional 4 years, he eventually crushed the rebellion and brought peace to the empire, ensuring that Shalmaneser's conquest and legacy would endure, and that Assyria would retain its status as the greatest power in the world. Thank you all for listening to the Conquerors podcast. If you like the podcast, don't forget to rate it and press the subscribe button. Your reviews and comments are most welcome. You can leave them on the podcast Facebook and Instagram pages called The Conquerors Podcast, a YouTube channel with the same name, or on iTunes or any platforms you guys use to listen. You can also contact me directly at theconquerorspodcast@gmail.com. Join me next time as I cover the reign and conquests of perhaps the greatest conqueror in Assyrian history, Tiglath-Pileser III.